Hello world, you're watching Homeschooling Scientist. You are joining us for our American history class, and we are finishing up our chapter on post-World War I America.
Yay!
Yay! Alright, so I think I'm going to kind of start off where we left off last time. So remember, this is kind of a chapter trying to summarize a lot of things that were changing in America at the time. And kind of the big idea here is after the war, there was a lot of tension. People kind of wanted to come back home and have fun and forget about their troubles and stuff like that. So this time period is often described as the Roaring Twenties. Lots of changes, lots of things going on. So I think last time we left off, we brought up that there was the re-emergence of the KKK in America. Obviously, since the Civil War era, America has sort of gradually been treating black people better and better, I guess you could say. But there was still, fights to be had for voting and all this other stuff, and so in the 20s, there's more acceptance of black people back than immediately after the Civil War, but it's still not great. And one of the things that drives the re-emergence of the KKK is sort of as black people start to spread out in the country, move out of the South, you have a lot of racism that starts to rear its head again in places even like in the North, which was kind of supposedly more accepting of black people. But it turns out in practice, they still had to face a lot of the same racism no matter where they went. Like, it wasn't just in the South. So you have this reemergence of the KKK, and it actually becomes a significant political force. Before, again, it was kind of this secret society, well, maybe not so secret, of racists and stuff in the South. And it held a lot of sway then, and in its reemergence, it kind of holds a lot of sway nationally even. Like in the 1920s, there's people who are like openly members of the KKK who are like members of Congress and things like that, and like big name politicians. Like, this wasn't just a small fringe group. And so again, like the KKK, it still exists today, but it's, basically a minority, like, fringe group. Like, there are no politicians today that go, hey, I'm a KKK member. You can't go in politics and expect to get elected by essentially supporting racist policies and things like that. But back in the 1920s, it was a thing that happened. And again, there were people who were members of the KKK and openly supported that, who were actual politicians that got elected and so on and so forth on that platform. Was kind of mostly concentrated in the Democrats, but frankly, there were members of the KKK in both political parties. And I think that's kind of an interesting thing to note. If you look at the politicians who were openly members of the KKK in the 20s, you could find them a decent number in both political parties. And so it wasn't like, I think sometimes people look at this and say like, oh, racism was all in like one political party and the other one was not racist. So at this point, at least in time, um, wasn't really located in like one political party. It was kind of both parties that um, I'm not going to say it was necessarily equal, but there was plenty of racism in both political parties. In addition to the fear of kind of black people and like racism and all this stuff that was happening, another fear that was kind of taking people over was the fear of communism. Because if you remember, we talked about at the end of World War One, the communists kind of took over Russia, and communism was becoming this bigger kind of idea that was spreading through the world a lot more and kind of becoming more popular. Who remembers what communism? You guys remember what communism is? What do we mean when we say?
It's like everybody shares, like nobody gets a house, their own house, nobody owns anything. It's like the government owns it all and they can give it or take it anytime they want.
Yeah. So the core of communism is essentially this idea that everybody kind of shares everything, which again, in practice might sound really good because we're like, hey, sharing is nice. But there's a difference between sharing, like voluntarily sharing. Um, like if there was a poor person and we look at that and say, oh man, let's go help them, let's go give them some food, share our food with them. And doing that voluntarily, like that's a good thing. But communism basically goes a step further, and it's like there's a poor person over there, and it's like government comes to your house and is like, I'm going to take your food and give it to that poor person over there, right? It's like it sounds good, right? Like helping people and sharing. But the problem is when you try to accomplish that by using force and violence. And I think this is a good time to mention that ultimately every law, if you think about it, every law is backed up by violence, right? So if you think about that for a second, what that means is every law that's on the books, if you disobey that law, cops, people with guns, will come to your house and they will, fine you, take money from you, uh, or arrest you, put you in a cage essentially. And if you try to resist, the consequences get worse and worse. And so every law ultimately is backed up by violence. And I think that's one thing that we have to think about when we are thinking about like what laws are good to have is it's not just a question of is this a good thing, it's is this something that should be enforced with violence, right? So to unpack that a bit, like a law that's like you shouldn't kill people, right? Like that's a good law, right? And that because that's something that should be enforced with violence, right? If there's somebody out there that's a murderer, like you want to stop them, and even if you have to use force, then that's a good thing. But like, something like feeding the poor, right? We would agree that it's a good thing to feed the poor, right? Now, the next question we got to ask is do we want to enforce feeding the poor with violence? And I think that's where you look at it and you say, okay, no, that doesn't make sense. Certainly if you have, the resources, the money to help other people, you should, but it's also not right for me to use violence to take money from somebody else. to help, even if it's for a good cause, right? Now, if they earn that money, like by doing bad things to people and stuff like that, or doing something illegal, then you can argue like maybe it makes sense to have a law to enforce that. But certainly if they're just like an average person, we shouldn't be just taking their money from them.
Especially if the government is the people doing it. The government can just take all the money from everybody and give them the bare minimum and let them get away with that.
Yeah, and this is what happens oftentimes. Now we're kind of introducing the idea of communism here. We'll spend some more time on it later, because this, as it turns out, this is why we're introducing the idea now. This whole idea, this kind of ideological battle with communism, is sort of a defining idea of sort of like the early 1900s, early to mid 1900s in America and really in the world. Because there was, after, again, we're sort of skipping ahead in history here, but after the communists took over Russia, it was kind of like a domino effect where there was a lot of other countries that started turning to communist. And so on the global scale, there was kind of this massive experiment with a lot of countries turning communist, trying it out. And spoiler, it always ended poorly. Some worse than others, but for some reason, communism is an extremely popular idea, even these days. But the reality is, it's been tried time and time and time again, and every time it's failed, and pretty much for the reason that you said, because once you give the government the power to sort of start taking money and redistributing wealth and all these other things, once the government has that kind of power, there's nothing to stop them from abusing it. But again, there's a lot of interesting things that happen in this time period. But the last one that I kind of want to cover for this lecture is the Scopes trial. Again, there was a lot of social changes and sort of the beginnings I talked about last time. There was the beginnings of this sort of turning away from our sort of like traditional Christian, at least maybe not fully Christian, but at least Christian respecting and kind of God-fearing culture to more of this culture of like, I just want to have fun and do what I want to do and stuff like that. And so this is also, I think, not coincidentally, when the teaching of evolution kind of became pushed to the forefront, and the Scopes trial was really the center of that. So the Scopes trial, sometimes called like the monkey trial, there's a movie about it called Inherit the Wind. I don't necessarily recommend it because it's really not very accurate as to what actually happened in the Scopes trial. I remember back when I was in college, I got like really interested in this for a little bit of time, and like even went back and was like reading some of the court transcripts and things like that. And if you do that and compare it to the movie and a lot of the sort of popular opinions about the Scopes trial, I don't think it's very accurate at all. But anyway, so the Scopes trial, I think the main thing to say, it was kind of a circus from the start. The whole thing was kind of just a setup, and it was basically a group of people, they got together, they wanted to challenge this law in Tennessee. There was a law against the teaching of evolution. I think if I recall, it had only been on the books for like 6 months, or like not even a year. Scopes, who was like the guy that was supposedly on trial for teaching evolution, um, probably didn't even teach evolution in his class. The whole trial was just kind of a show. I think it's also interesting to point out why the teaching of evolution, was banned, especially back then. Evolution was very closely tied to these ideas of racism and eugenics. Now, I'm sure there was also part of it that was, people who said, "Well, we're Christians and we just want to teach the Bible and we don't want this newfangled evolution teaching and so on and so forth." I'm sure there was part of that too, but also part of it that can't be denied is that um, evolution, especially in its beginnings, was a very racist idea. It's not a logical leap at all to suggest, well, if humans evolved from monkeys and stuff and we keep evolving, so clearly some humans are more evolved than others, right? That would be a logical thought if evolution is true. So people used evolution to prop up this idea that, hey, white people are more evolved and black people are less evolved, and so on and so forth. So they used this as a way to support racism and discrimination against black people. So
how wouldn't they know that if this was all true? How wouldn't they know that black people weren't more evolved than them?
they didn't. But now, I mean, they had reasons, right? So there was a lot of stuff, and it was frank. There was a lot of like junk science done around this time. So, like for example, one of the things people used to look at is like the average size of your skull and like things like that, and um, like certain bone markers and like all this stuff that they claimed showed that like white people were more intelligent and black people were less intelligent and so on and so forth. And it's all of that has basically been pretty well debunked. That it's just kind of junk science. But um, it's one of those things that I think people don't realize that they have this idea of science as this pure objective search for truth, and that's what we wish that it was. But the reality is that scientists are people just like anybody else, and there's still a lot of bias that can happen in science. And if you're a person who's a scientist who's a racist, um, you're going to go out into the world and try to find evidence to support what you want to be true. And if you want racism to be true, you're going to try to go out and find evidence to support that. And that's basically what they did. And frankly, that's what still happens today with a lot of things. It takes a lot of work to be truly objective, um, even in things that are not political or moral or whatever. But certainly when there's morals and politics involved, people have very strong biases. And when you're talking about like core beliefs about even something like, do you believe in God or not? Um, and I mean that on both sides, for people who believe in God and people who are atheists. Both of those groups have to deal with the fact that you have strong biases to go out into the world and try to find evidence that supports your view. But to actually try to take an objective stance and say, I'm going to just look for what is out there, what's actually truth, that's much harder to do, right? And again, I say that for Christians and for atheists and for everything. That's how, again, that's how what they said. That's how they said that white people were more evolved, but you know, again, it's kind of just stuff that they made up, and it,
Fake science.
yeah, fake news, fake science. So again, going back to the Scopes trial, this is one of the reasons that evolution was the teaching of evolution was a hot topic, was because you know you don't. It's kind of like this question of, do you really want to be teaching this ideology to students, to young students, and that is so closely linked to racism and eugenics. So eugenics was another thing that was kind of becoming popular at the time in America and in Europe amongst kind of intellectual circles. Um, and eugenics is again it's sort of similar to it again has like a close connection to racism, in that eugenics is kind of like the idea that we can control um, the evolution of humans, essentially, that we should guide essentially the breeding of humans. And so people who are less desirable, people who are maybe like poor, or people who are not smart and everything, that we shouldn't allow them to have babies. And people who are smart and successful and healthy and all that, that we should allow them to, we should sort of focus on people who are smart and healthy and all that. They should be the ones having babies, and people who are like poor or criminals or whatever, that they should be not allowed to have babies. To the extent that there were even in America, where we pride ourselves on freedom, there were things like forced sterilizations, where basically people who are like criminals or whatever, they do something and they would go in and basically make them not able to have babies anymore. Because, you know, the idea was like, hey, you're a undesirable type of person, so we need to keep you from spreading your DNA and spreading your genes, so that we can become more highly evolved over time, right? Sort of like this idea of guiding the evolution of the human race. So this is another idea that was very closely linked to the teaching of evolution, right? Because obviously you contrast that with Christianity, that teaches, you know, everybody's made in God's image. You know, human beings have sort of intrinsic value, whether they're smart, dumb, whatever, and you don't get to discriminate against somebody, or something, anything like that, just because somebody isn't smart, right? And you know, we believe that kind of everybody's different, everybody has values in their own way, and so on and so forth, but that they're ultimately, everybody's made in the image of God. And so, you know, we shouldn't, you know, basically do bad things to other people just because they aren't smart, right? So, anyway, that's kind of all those things that led into it was why the teaching of evolution was controversial. And I think, frankly, those things are still true today. It's just because evolution is so popular now, they kind of people kind of don't talk about that part. That, like, well, if evolution is true, then racism kind of makes sense. It's like, well, we're not going to talk about that, you know.
So why are if we like came from monkeys, then why aren't all the monkeys humans?
Well, so because we didn't necessarily come from monkeys, so in the evolutionary story, humans and monkeys share a common ancestor. So it's kind of like you've got humans, you got monkeys, and supposedly, right, back, however millions of years ago, there was an animal that existed that was sort of like a mix of the two, or somewhere in between. That there was this common ancestor, and part of the population evolved to become monkeys, and part of that population evolved to become humans. So evolution doesn't necessarily teach that just because there's a new organism doesn't mean like the old one has to be wiped out. But also, again, that we did, strictly speaking, we didn't evolve from monkeys. That it was a human ape common ancestor. And all right, to wrap up on this idea of the Scopes trial, again, main thing to know is it was kind of a big circus. And I don't think that the Christians who were, part of the defense did a particularly great job. But I also think that a lot of what's said about it is, frankly dishonest to, again, try to prop up the teaching of evolution and make Christians look like idiots and stuff like that. Oh, I think it's also, worth mentioning that they won the trial. So the guy who was trying to, the defense, the guy who was supposedly teaching evolution lost his case. But again, it was never about that. It was, about this whole, big circus to, kind of make Christians look stupid and make the town famous. All right, so that's pretty much everything from this chapter, at least all the big ideas. Again, we'll cover some of the less important stuff and like your worksheets and things like that. But for now, you've been watching Homeschooling Scientist. Peace out.